Hello, my name is Melissa Jennison and welcome to Discussions in Audio Mastering. Have you ever read the literature attached to a CD or DVD, vinyl record or tape cassette, and ever wondered, what does mastering mean? While most of us understand the terms recording and mixing, very few recognise mastering. It is the aim of these discussions to inform and educate those interested in audio about the art of mastering. We were fortunate enough to have discussions with 5 top Melbourne-based mastering engineers who shed some light and engineering wisdom on this little-known and understood audio process. Are songs mastered differently for radio play as compared to home listening?
Maybe once upon a time that was the case, but these days, if the song sounds great on a variety of speakers, radio will take care of itself. These days, budgets don't allow to go mastering different versions for different situations. So with the enormous amount of compression put on top of songs that are already so loud, I mean, every little difference you may do for a radio version pretty much is left unrecognised these days by the time it comes across the airwaves.
Yeah, no difference.
Here's another interesting one. Some people think that there's a certain style of mastering for radio. I personally don't believe that to be the case. I think mastering's about translation. So a well-mastered tune should be able to play well across a different range of playback systems, of course limited by the limitation of the playback system itself. Radio mastering, I think that's been used by people in the past as a marketing ploy and thinking that there's some kind of magic about it. The reason I say that is because if you look at radio, for example, AM and FM radio sound different. Different stations within the FM band sound different to each other, and stations are constantly tweaking their sound, so it's in a state of flux. So how do you predict these things? Do you know what I mean? How do you say, okay, well Triple J this week is sounding a bit dull, next week they're going to be a little bit brighter. It's a moving target. So if you make your stuff sound great, it should sound great, regardless of whatever filter is going to be placed on it in a radio setting. Because if that was the case, Waves would have had a plug-in now with a preset called Radio, and it would just make everything sound the same. And music's different, you know, every song's different. And, you know, you could take a playlist from a radio station through the course of a day, line it up in Pro Tools and have it at Unity Gain, and what's going to be the common denominator amongst them? There isn't. You know, every station, I guess, will play according to what their format is and what their demographic is, and so you could say maybe stylistically there's some kind of commonality, but in terms of tone there's always going to be some variance. So I don't subscribe to that school. The only time I'd ever think that there's some differences perhaps in the way you approach your mastering is perhaps for vinyl. and vinyl being a mechanical medium, and there are consequences depending on how you master things. And with vinyl, it's more about bottom end and out of phase and maybe some sibilance. And so there are some things you need to take into account. But other than that, no, I just think just make the stuff sound good, so it will play well regardless of whether it's your laptop or a big club system on radio or on a TV or whatever. So
there used to be a lot of that back in the day, but the radio stations tend to sort of remaster everything when they transmit. So you know, their chain is basically like a mastering chain, and they just slam everything, you know, far too much and spread the stereo and just do all sorts of things to it, and it's really hard to preempt what they do. So I just think you get it sounding the best that you can and put your best foot forward, and you know, generally speaking, it'll sound good pretty much anywhere.
No, not really. I think once something's mastered well, the aim is for it to translate everywhere. There's really nothing that you can do to compensate for different, you know, you can't really second guess what someone's stereo is going to do, or you have to just get that sound you're familiar with in your room, and that you've, you know, I think mastering engineers, they know what sounds good in their room, and that's why people kind of go to you and paying the dollars, because they know that you know your room and what sound is coming out of those speakers will travel well everywhere. And so you don't do a lot to compensate for different environments. You just kind of get the sound that you're familiar with and you're comfortable with. And once you know that, and you've heard that sound everywhere on radio and at home, and you get comfortable with that, and you know that it's going to sound good everywhere. There's not a lot you need to do for radio. Radio does a lot of processing to your sound. And every radio station is different, so what do? You'd have to master differently for every radio station. So what you do is you get a universal sound that you know is going to sound good everywhere, and in your room, a mastering engineer's room is really balanced and even. Once you get it right in there on really critical monitors that are uncoloured, they're not very flattering, and they're very flat. Once they sound pretty good and vibey on a system like that, then everywhere else you're going to be kind of safe.
Do you encourage clients to get involved in the mastering process?
I don't have a problem. I have a problem with 5 guys in a confined space having a party. That's not a mastering session. That's a party. I love to party. Don't do it when we're mastering the record, you know. I don't have a problem with people coming in and giving me their feedback about the way they want their record. That's important, that I understand. You know, it's not my record, it's their record. I say to them, your name's on the poster. Hey, you know, I'll do the best I can for you, but I want to understand what you want me to do, and I'll give you my feedback and response.
Yeah, definitely. I prefer if clients are here, because it's better to find out if they're not happy after the first song than when you've finished the whole album. Yeah. So if they're here and they're contributing, you know, maybe they didn't want their album to sound so bright overall, then we find that out on the way, and we can, you know, keep them happy.
Yeah. One of the things I really dislike about mastering is it's been touted as being the black art, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's simply just a craft, no different to songwriting or mixing or producing or playing or whatever, you know, because mastering hasn't had and doesn't really have a lot of prestige and profile. It's an unknown quantity, and so it's easy for people to kind of think about that it's, you know, that mastering engineers are the gatekeepers to the secret society or some kind of thing like that, and that's just totally false. So for me, I think the more I can engage the client within the process, I think it helps, because when they understand what I can do, and more importantly what I can't achieve, then they're going to go off and make better records, and that's also a part of the whole relationship building that you have with a client. So it's good for them to know what you can and what you can't do, and it's a good skill for them to have, because sometimes an artist may want to just whack up something real quick to take out to play in the car to see how their mix would translate in a sort of rough kind of mastering scenario. So if you know, I'm happy to help, and sometimes they ask me questions like, what would you do, how'd you set this plug in, and I'm happy to share that kind of knowledge with my clients. No problem at all.
Do you encourage clients to get involved in the mastering process?
I wouldn't say we encourage them. Of course, everybody is welcome. But you know, we do have a long checklist of things to go through, and I personally like to act as quickly as I can. I get most things become apparent, and I get a lot of ideas in the very beginning listening to music. I find that the more I talk about it or listen to other people's ideas, I do start to get a little distracted, and sometimes don't come up with as good as end product as I probably could have if I was just left to my own. But as I said, sure, people are welcome here, but most artists don't understand the process, so to be there, to encourage them to be there, doesn't serve much purpose other than their own entertainment. They can kick back and watch what's going on, but they do tend to get pretty bored after a short amount of time.
Do you have a favourite piece of studio gear?
Oh wow, a lot of gear here is one employee of the month, I think, but I have to say I always keep coming back to the Sontec EQ, which I love so much. It's gotten me out of trouble many a time. It's so flexible and has such an amazing sound. Yeah, Sontec rocks.
Excellent.
Yeah. If I really had to name one, it breaks my heart not naming a few others, but yeah, it's good.
My room. Yeah, I think my room. I think when we built this place in 2006, we made a decision to really invest heavily on getting George Augsburger, who's just an absolute legend in the acoustics world, and probably has very few, if any, peers. Because again, if your room isn't right, and right is a relative term. I mean, there's no such thing as the perfect room, but you know, if you've got a really good room that's fairly flat and accurate, and you can hear what's going on, even if you're in a room that's not that great, it doesn't matter how good the bit of gear is. If you can't hear what's actually doing, it's giving you a false picture. So my favourite bit of gear, if you want to call it, that's the room. But if you want to talk about the hardware, I'd probably say my Sontec EQ is probably my favourite bit of gear. Bit of a Rolls Royce of mastering EQs, and took me a long time to get one of those little puppies. In fact, I'm lucky enough to have two of them. But that's probably my favourite bit of gear, and I find that quite indispensable. Yeah.
I think my favourite piece of studio gear is my room and my speakers. You know, they're the things that I know and trust, and all the other stuff. I mean, look, as I said, it's about the music. You know, if I can find a record that be involved, if I can listen to a record that people bring into master, and I don't have to do too much, instantly I love that record. Because it's been, you know, the engineer has done a great job. There's a few excellent mix engineers around the traps here in Melbourne.
I'm a big fan of George Massenberg's design, so anything that he kind of has had a hand in I love. So I've got a GML EQ and we've got a Sontec EQ in this room, and George has had a hand in both of those, so he's a great designer. So yeah, I really, GML EQ is great, but you know, we've got API EQs in both rooms and they're really good as well, and we've got a good variety, but you know, yeah, I love, GML is great, it's my main weapon.
I guess if I had one piece of studio gear that I use, it would probably be the TubeTech multi-band valve compressor that I've got. It just tends to... you can separate the kick, drum and bass in a recording from the rest of the recording, and when you're compressing a track, I don't want to get too technical, but when you're compressing a track, the compressor's generally driven by the kick, drum and bass in a rock recording, and if you can separate the bottom end out with a multi-band compressor, then you can treat that separately. It doesn't affect the vocals and things like that. And the TubeTech does it in a very nice way. It's valves, so it's a little bit noisy, so you don't want to use it on a very dynamic classical recording, for instance, because you will hear that noise, but on a rock recording it's really good.
With sample rates at around 192 kilohertz and getting higher, do you think digital will ever sound like analog?
Well, I think it does sound like analog. When I've done blindfold tests with people, where you compare a good half-inch recording with a 48 kilohertz 24-bit recording, 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit recording, and a 96K 24-bit recording, and people can't consistently pick the difference when you don't tell them which one is which.
Yes.
If you tell them, then they can hear it. But so I think digital is very, very good.
Inherently, they're really different. So I don't know if it will ever sound the same or if it should sound the same. Because digital is so much more of a linear kind of soundscape. It's very flat and uncoloured. Analog has so much more unknown characteristics, and it introduces all kinds of things. To answer your question, is it probably won't ever sound the same, but I think we're always going to try and make it sound a little bit retrospective like analog. I think the human ear really likes that kind of sound, to be honest.
I think some of the old school guys like myself would like to think that, look, it's analog and it'll always be, nothing will be like analog, etc., etc. But I think you'd be a little naive to think that with the way technology's going and how it's exponentially getting faster and better, and there are really some really smart people out there who are working, at the coalface in terms of algorithms, etc. I don't see why it isn't possible for it to happen, where you will be able to have a situation of a plug-in that really is quite indistinguishable from analog. Having said that, I still think that there'll still be some people that just through their own mind, unless they feel that their equipment goes through a box that's got transformers and valves and metal in it, there's just something in their own mind where it's a placebo thing more than anything else. But look, I'm sure it'll happen, where the day will come where you won't be able to distinguish between the two of them.
Well, so for me, with my understanding of what digital does and what analog does, we're talking about two different horses here for a start. The analog audio, and depending on whether we want to talk about analog tape recorders, they had design limitations that they overcame. And in the course of overcoming these design limitations, they put in a thing called the head bump, which is a low frequency response EQ on the playback curve of the analog tape recorder. And I'm talking multi-track recorders here, where what you recorded onto the tape actually came off sounding warmer, because it was this broadband EQ that was across the multi-track playback head for all intents and purposes. Now, when people got used to that sound, it became known as the analog warmth. Now, in digital is flat on the bottom end, where it doesn't have any of that characteristic. So as an engineer, you had to learn, once we went from analog to digital, we had to learn a whole new series of tricks, understanding that that's what was going on with the analog characteristic as opposed to the digital characteristic. Now, analog goes out to 30,000 cycles, okay? Now, CDs will go out to 22,000 cycles for all intents and purposes. Now, the question is, can we hear the difference between 22 and 30? If we're talking a piece of vinyl here, every piece of vinyl that you have listened to in your life below 100 cycles will have been rolled off to stop the needle, the cutting needle, skewing. What do I mean by that? Now, when you go to a cutting session, what happens is that the engineer is sending the audio to the cutting head, but we're monitoring it through a delay before it gets sent to the cutting head. So every time the drummer goes dugga-da, dugga-da, dugga-da round the kit, and the engineer's trying to cut a loud cut, therefore he's trying to get a deep groove into the record, what he does, because the drummer is playing the tom-toms across the stereo panorama, and we're talking about some low-frequency information, to stop that cutting head skewing, he hits a mono button, which then monos the low-frequency information under 100 cycles. So consequently, the low-frequency information on vinyl records is mono for all intents and purposes. which is entirely different to the capabilities of a CD. Because with CDs, you don't have phase anomalies that are created by low frequencies being panned hard left right. You don't have issues with phase anomalies. Therefore, you can do wild and wacky stuff where you pan low frequency information to one side without getting into that characteristic issue that potentially is there with vinyl. So there's a whole series of things that we really have to understand as to whether, in fact, we're talking about the same thing. They're both different horses to me, you know.
With sample rates at around 192 kilohertz and getting higher, do you think digital will ever sound like analog?
Digital audio, I mean, if we're talking at 192K, look, I pulled out some stuff just to give people appropriate information. There is out on the net, there's lots of great stuff if you want to go out there and have a look at the right resources. So a great resource is Dan Lavery Engineering, Lavry. Okay, now Dan Lavery designs digital to analog converters. In many of the studios in the world, there are these Lavery converters. Okay, now there's a paper up on his Dan Lavery Engineering site which specifically talks about sampling theory for digital audio. Now, let me just, and we're talking at elevated sample rates. Let me read this to you, just so you get there, because these are the facts. This article, and it's a 15-page article, along with all the flowcharts and test pictures and a whole range of stuff, and it is the truth. He's talking about the Nyquist theorem, okay, which is the essence of what digital audio is about, the sampling rate of digital audio. And he says, this article offers a general explanation. The author's motivation is to help dispel the widespread misconceptions regarding sampling of audio at rates of 192K. This misconception, propagated by industry salesmen, is built on a false premise. Now, that's all we're going to read about that, okay? If you want to read another great resource from David Gressinger, Gressinger. David Gressinger is a lexicon designer. He writes the software algorithms for all their reverb. Again, we're talking two of the great audio gods of the world. Perception of mid and high frequency intermodulation distortion in loudspeakers and its relationship to high definition audio. So, in answer to your question of about 192K and above, I don't buy into 192K. Okay, Lavery's saying 96K is where it is. Okay, after that, there is stuff there that potentially can be the equipment and not the music. Okay, that's the brief, cutting to the chase of his 15-page article. But it would be inappropriate for me to summarise it too much. But I'm trying to say to people, go out there and do your homework, get the right information. Two names to remember, David Gressinger and Dan Lavery, will give you some of that right information. Okay, 192K, and then we go back to an MP3. Hello, what's going on here? There is something really wrong about this.
We hope you've enjoyed discussions in audio mastering and have a greater understanding of the necessary processes and what is involved for an experienced engineer to attain a professional standard of audio fidelity.
Something of the music. Come on! Something of the music.
All right, baby! Come on! Let's rock! Does she see me looking at her? Let's roll! Come on! Does she see me looking? Wow!